Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about unit rates. But before we do that, I want to kind of recap what we learned in our first unit. If you remember, our first unit was about ratios. And ratios are how we compare the amount or the value of certain numbers. So we define that as the relative sizes, in other words, how one amount compares to the other of two or more numbers. So let's say, for instance, that we wanted to compare the number of boys in a class to the number of girls. Then that would be written as the ratio. Oh, sorry, let me fix my pen. Of boys to girls. So let's say that there are 5 boys for every 4 girls in the class. Then we can use that to say if there was a larger class, then we might expect, for instance, if there were 30 boys, then there would be 24 girls. Because there has to be a multiplicative relationship in order for the ratios to remain the same. So in other words, because 30 is 6 times 5, then we need to have 4 times 6 to give us 24 girls in the class. Now, you might also remember that we talked about 3 different ways that you can write a ratio. So you could write a ratio as being 5 to 4, 5 to 4 with the actual word, or you could write it as a fraction. Now, this one's going to be important because we're going to use this one, usually use fractions when we're talking about unit rates. Okay, so now that we've had a quick recap of ratios, let's talk more specifically about a type of ratio, which is called a rate. A rate compares values that have different measurements, okay? So things that are not necessarily measured in the same way. So we might talk, for instance, about the cost per amount of something that's purchased. We could talk about distance over time. We could talk about the cost of something per month. For instance, like a monthly phone bill. Or we could talk about things like words typed per minute, if we're trying to measure the speed of something. So notice here, this is going to be important to make note of, that cost, time, and distance are common rates. So when we are working on real-world problems, cost and distance and time are really going to be very, very common problems that you're going to see. So when we're working with a rate problem, one of the best and easiest ways to compare 2 different rates is to think about them in terms of their unit rate. So a unit rate is comparing the value of something per 1 unit of measure. So it's basically a ratio that has been simplified down to have a denominator of 1. So let's talk then, for instance, about if we're dealing with miles per hour, okay? That means how many miles we're going each single hour. Okay, another common example of a unit rate would be the cost per pound. That's the cost for 1 pound of an item. Or generally talking about the cost per single item. So we talked before about, for instance, the cost if you're buying a 12-pack of soda. We could compare that to a different amount of soda by calculating the cost for each single can of soda. Or if you wanted to calculate the cost of eggs, calculating the cost for each individual egg. So one of the easiest ones that I like to use as an example is talking about speed in miles per hour. So let's say we wanted to compare these 2 different cars, and one car is driving 80 miles in 2 hours, and the other car is driving 90 miles in 3 hours. Well, which car is going faster? It's hard to tell if we're talking about the distance over 2 hours for one of them and over 3 hours for the other. So what we want to do is calculate their unit rate. So if we had 80 miles in 2 hours, notice now that I'm using my rates are being expressed in fractions. And that's going to be very, very common. We're going to use that a lot this unit. So if we want to calculate the speed for a car going 80 miles in 2 hours, then that means that every 1 hour, they're going to drive 40 miles. Now for the other car going 90 miles in 3 hours, that's equivalent to going, for every 1 hour, that's equivalent to going 30 miles. And notice here that I just simplified my fractions, basically. Before I had 80 over 2, and I noticed that from the 2 to get to 1, I divide by 2. So I took my 80 and I divided it by 2. Over here, I took my 3, divided by 3 to get 1. So 90 divided by 3 gives me 30. Later on in the unit, we're going to learn about unit conversions, which are a way to compare the measurements of basically the same thing in two different ways. So for instance, we measure distance in a lot of different ways, but we might, in some cases, want to compare yards to feet, or feet to inches. If we're talking about volume, we might then need to talk about the difference between a gallon and a pint. Or we could compare ounces to cups. You'll use these kinds of measurements, especially ounces to cups, in the kitchen when you're cooking. So these will be really, really valuable in learning about how to deal with ratios in real life. Now again, we're not going to go into too much detail on this yet, but we will get to it later on in the unit. So stay tuned. So another thing that we're going to learn about later in the unit using ratios and rates is percents. A percent is basically a ratio that's out of 100. The most common example that you're going to use this with is going to be probably grades. So you've actually been using percents quite a bit already and maybe didn't even know it yet. So let's say, for instance, that you get an 8 out of a 10 on a quiz. Well, to talk about your grade, or what your grade is on that, well, we want to compare that to 100. So since 100 is 10 times 10, then an 8 times 10 is an 80. So that would mean that you got an 80% on that test. And we'll talk in more detail about what percents are and how we use them later in the unit. Okay, so now that we have our vocabulary down, let's work on a couple examples of unit rate problems. So here's an example. We have a jet traveling 600 miles in 5 hours. At this rate, how far could the jet fly in 8 hours? What is the rate of speed of the jet? So notice that 8 is not a multiple of 5, so we can't very easily multiply 600 by any whole number to get the number of miles traveled in 8 hours. So what we'll use instead is our unit rate. For our unit rate, we need to figure out how many miles we can travel in 1 hour. So we're going to set up a proportion, and that's basically two equivalent fractions. So 600 miles in 5 hours is equivalent to some number of miles in 1 hour. Well, from 5 to 1, we divide by 5. So we're going to do the same thing up top. What is 600 divided by 5? Well, it might be a little bit easier to think of this as 60 divided by 5 and then tack on that extra 0 at the end. So 60 divided by 5 is 12. So that means that this here should be 120 miles. In other words, this jet is traveling 120 miles every hour. Now we can use this to figure out how many miles we would travel in 8 hours, okay? Because 8 is 8 times 1, then we need to multiply 120 by 8. In other words, we're figuring out that for 120 miles every hour over the course of 8 hours, then 120 times 8, we can think of this again as 12 times 8, which is 96, and put the 0 on at the end. If you don't believe me, check the work. 0 times 8 is 0. 8 times 2 is 16. Carry that 1, and 8 times 1 is 8, plus 1 is 9. So we have 960 miles traveled in 8 hours. Now notice for that last question here where we have, it asks us the rate of speed of the jet. Well, the rate of speed is this ratio right here, 120 miles per hour. Okay, so another common example that we're going to use is figuring out the better buy. In other words, which purchase will give us more bang for our buck. At the Quick Market, we can buy 3 apples for $1.17, or at the Stop and Save, we can buy 5 apples for $2.40. So which one is going to allow us to save more money? Well, we can do this by figuring out the cost per item. Okay, that is going to be our unit rate. So we want to figure out then what is going to be the cost at the Quick Market for each individual apple versus the cost at the Stop and Save for each individual apple. So I'm going to say QM, meaning Quick Market, and we can compare that to the Stop and Save. So over here I'm going to do my calculation, and in order to figure out the cost per item, remember if we set this up as a fraction, that's 117 over 3. Basically, we're dividing to figure out what the cost is for each individual apple. Remember that a fraction bar, like we see here, is division, okay? So, $1.17 for 3 apples means we need to divide. So, 3 goes into 11 3 times, giving us 9. 11 minus 9 is 2. Bring down my 7. 3 goes into 27 9 times. 9 times 3 is 27, meaning that we have nothing remaining. So that means the cost is 39 cents per apple. And that's at the Quick Market. Now at the Stop and Save, we're paying $2.40 for 5 apples. So the cost for every single apple would be $2.40 divided by 5. Now 5 goes into 24 4 times. 4 times 5 is 20. 5 goes into 40 8 times. And again, I have nothing else remaining, so the cost here is 48 cents per apple. Okay, so that means that I can save 9 cents by going to the Quick Market. I save 9 cents for every apple that I buy. So that's pretty much all there is to unit rate. Go ahead and try the practice problems on the back. What I want you to be very careful to do is to make sure that you write down any questions that you have so that we can discuss them tomorrow.